Or good morning, everyone. Hi, hey Ruth, shalom, hey Robert. Hi Diane, nice to see you. Hi everyone. Well, it's lovely to have you here. I just did a very quick change up on my Hey P&A, hey guys, big hugs to you. Hey Chloe, nice. Hey Marlene, nice to see you. So it's lovely to have everyone here. I is everyone just hearing me fine? Because I don't put in headphones because I'm sitting in the house, of course. Hi Annie. Hopefully we're all good. Noreen, yeah, it was fun. This is going to be in some ways a little bit of a lighter raw history. But hi, Casey. And that's because it's, well, not as powerful necessarily a subject as I do talk about very often. Hey, Ken. So it's nice to have you all here. There's actually quite a few. I'm always surprised when I put up kind of a history talk, how many people sign up to come on. But so I'll wait, a few more people will be signing on. But I just want to say, first of all, hi there. It's lovely to be home. Bonjour, Nat. It's nice to be literally back home. And it's chilly. It's still below freezing in the backyard. In fact, we always like to go and have a look at the yard. So let's do that. But I do want to just set expectations, of course, to everyone. Obviously, these are just talks. Hi, Viola. And if a sort of seated historical talk is not for you, my feelings will not be hurt whatsoever. Look at the backyard out here right now. See? The flowers are kind of frozen for the rest of the winter now. And do we barbecue all winter? Of course we barbecue all winter. So, but I will show you, let's see what the temperature's saying right now. There we go. So there is just below freezing. So it's kind of a nice temperature out here. And yeah, so I should probably put the umbrella away for the season. But look at this, enough warmth off the house that some of the flowers are still hanging on. Isn't it fun? So I'm always very honored when Patrick and Aaron are here with us. They obviously caught Finn's tour the other night. So Finn's home on Friday, by the way. So just as a quick hello, the reason and people have been asking me for other raw histories. And so this one just seemed kind of self-evident because, of course, I've just come back the other day from Newfoundland and Saint-Pierre et Miquelon, which is one of those peculiar hangovers from the colonial period that is kind of unique. It's one of those places. I remember I gave a talk one day on Easter Island, Rapa Nui, and people were fascinated by that. So I thought, why don't I give a talk about the islands of Saint-Pierre and Miquelon, but also just give a little bit of background to why France is still just off the shore of Canada. It is fun to see. Now, it's always a little fun and interactive to try and focus in on the screen here, but hopefully you're seeing that kind of all right. I can get this a little bit closer, maybe. No, that's about the limit. So now I have a backup, by the way, gimbal here that I couldn't get to balance. But the last time I did one of these, the motor went a little funky on it. So, well, that's the thing, Robert. People just haven't heard of this. So that's why I think it's a fun conversation to have. But there we have, let's say, obviously the center of the Atlantic. Those of you who do my geology tours and stuff very often are up here in Iceland with me because I talk about the Mid-Atlantic Rift and the formation of the land. And so the rock is right here. That's Newfoundland, and the mainland part is Labrador. Let me just for a second, though, before we carry on down to really the purpose of our conversation today, is I want to go up way up here. There's Greenland, Baffin Island, Ellesmere Island, and this is that exciting little place right up here. Some of you will know where I'm going with this, but I guess I'll scan in on this one. Sorry. Up there, do you see that? Right there? That, ladies and gentlemen, is Hans Island, and that is why Canada now has an international border with Europe. So we literally have that island. It's about 55%. It's either that one or it might even be the smaller one. I think it might even be this one up here. But that's because, and this is relevant, hey T&J, this is relevant to what we're talking about today because the French settlement in North America and the British settlement was not about North America, right? It was about finding the Northwest Passage. Well, now in this world of rather abrupt climate change that we're going through, the ice is melting through this passage. And so this is where we've been at a state of war. Oh, is that right, Lynn? Yeah. We don't have fireworks in the national park because of the effect on animals. But this whole channel is opening up and it's a shipping route. But this one of these little islands, I think it's that one right there in the middle, whoever controls that controls the channel. And so this is why Canada was at a state of war over that island with the Kingdom of Denmark, because of course the Kingdom of Denmark includes Greenland, even though Greenland's not in the European Union. That's actually another good raw history at some point. Hi, Sairi. But controlling this passage will be one of the new shipping routes in our world if we don't have a complete collapse environmentally. But right over here, for example, is a tiny outport called Eureka. So that's way up north there. Let me just quickly tell you about this war we've been in with Denmark. So once a year, the Canadian Rangers, who are up here in Nunavut, would go over to this island and they would put up a Canadian flag and they would leave a bottle of Canadian whiskey. Then once a year, the Danish Greenlandic soldiers would come over, take away the Canadian flag, drink the whiskey, presumably. They'd put up a Danish flag and they'd leave a bottle of schnapps. So that was our ongoing conflict with the Kingdom of Denmark. That's how you have a war. Now, with everything breaking out in Ukraine and all just this horrendousness that's been going on around the world, the two countries decided that they really needed to get this together. And so we came up with a deal. And because the island is closer to Greenland than is Canada, it's about 55% Danish and 45% Canadian. And oh boy, now I want to go there to the land border. But that brings us back to the point of today's conversation, because as we go south, look how far south Newfoundland is, right? So Canada is tipped from northwest to southeast. But this island of Newfoundland, if you draw a line straight across, you're over about Brittany. Guess where everyone came from originally? Brittany and the Basque Country. They were the fishing people that would come over into these bays. There is really no doubt that people were over fishing off the Grand Banks before the so-called European discovery of this continent. That's pretty clear. But let's just talk about some of the historical creatures. Needless to say, Christopher Columbus leaves Spain, sails all the way over to Santo Domingo, which is the island of Hispaniola. That was the first trip when they arrived there, and they, of course, quantify the fact that there's land on the side. It took Columbus 3 journeys to get that there was actually a continent here, and that's why to this day they're called the West Indies, but of course they should have been called the East Indies if they thought they're in India, because they'd be on the east side. And that's just as a side point, and I've made this comment before. So they arrive there, they think they're in India, they call the indigenous people Indians. Within a month, they know they're not in India. And 500 years later, people are still referring to indigenous North and South Americans as Indians. Like, that's how silly that is, just as a term. Joanne will talk a little bit about the Irish settlement. But then the British send over an Italian, Giovanni Cavati, but he left from Bristol, and he sails over here into a bay that is, of course, probably where St. John's is, where I did those tours, sails in there, or Conception Bay South may be where he landed, comes into that bay, puts up, because he was hired by the British government, the British monarchy, sails in there, puts up a Union flag and calls it a newfound land, or Terra Nova. So that is that settlement. However, keep in mind that we know 100% right up at the very, very top of this huge peninsula here on the island of Newfoundland. There's an archaeological site there called Lanso Meadows, and the Vikings were living there 1,000 years ago. I was sort of hoping I could even bring it up, but everything's so tiny small here. I had a big goal to try and get there on this trip, but this time of year, everything was closed down. Anyway, it's not coming up here, but it's near this town of St. Anthony. That, to put in perspective of distance, from St. John's, for me to go up and see Lanso Meadows would have been an 11.5-hour drive. So that's how vast it is. And of course, it was all settled along maritime lands. Gregory, so that's a good question. Let me come back to that for a second. That's really an excellent question. So Gregory's asked, how did they know that it wasn't Asia so quickly? Well, first of all, Europeans had been to India. So they already had some markers to measure, and they had been to Indonesia. Hi, Patty. Nice to see you there. But so we had Giovanni Cavati, John Cabot comes over into the Bay of St. John's. Christopher Columbus is to the south, and the French sent over out of Saint-Malo, which is really fun, Jacques Cartier. He sails into this bay, and he's the one that names this the Gulf of St. Lawrence. He then starts to go up the St. Lawrence River to where the river narrows. Many of you will know that is the word Quebec in the Algonquin language. then carries on further up to an island, which has a very small hill. The land around Montreal is very, very flat. And so he declares it a royal mountain, or a Mont Réal. But he couldn't go any further because of big rapids that were around the island. And to this day, they call them the Rapides de la Chine, the China Rapids, because he still was thinking on the other side, they would have found a passage in through Asia, or into Asia. However, all of that, hey, Ginny, all of that comes crashing down. They work out sometime by about 1510, 1512, they work out that this was actually a landmass unto itself, because if you explored any further up to these Great Lakes, you realize they were lakes that were draining out a basin that wasn't ocean. So they weren't hitting salt water. So they knew that. So there was one of your keys. So thank you, Gregory, for that question. Another key why they realized that this was not a continent, or not Asia, but a continent unto itself. And I actually have a YouTube video from Portobello in Panama. That was Columbus's third or fourth voyage. By the way, Columbus's life was not very much fun at the end. He really spent 10 years dying of gout. But Portobello is up on the Caribbean side of Panama. This is when they realized there was an isthmus across here. This is when they found that this was this narrowest portion across, and they realized it was connecting two land masses. So they actually figured out relatively quickly, and it wasn't until, why don't we just scan out for the fun of it? It wasn't until Magellan, now remember the Pope, the Vatican, had actually separated the whole world between Portugal and Spain, which wasn't very nice to the rest of the world. But Magellan sailed over, went into near Recife, or near Bahia, where Sayuri is, loaded up in provisions, thanks Noreen, sailed all the way down, and it wasn't until they went through the Magellan Straits. He should have probably known when they were named the Magellan Straits that he'd get through. But in real terms, they went through by where Punta Arenas now is in Chile, and they realized they could turn a corner into a gentle or Pacific Ocean. And they eventually sailed all. He was killed over in Indonesia because he tried to kill a lot of people. So that was Magellan's life. So that's where they realized there was this giant two sets of continents here blocking the world. As I've talked about so often, a map maker, thanks Marlene, a map maker in Italy, Mr. Amici Medici, went to a map making. He said, I'm plotting out all the information coming back from these voyages over here. And they said to him, well, what do you call this new landmass? And then he said, I don't have a name for it. So they named it America. So America is not actually a rude term, but also I like the idea that we say particularly here, and I hear it on the radio when I listen to Indigenous radio, North America, by many of the Algonquin languages, is called Turtle Island because of the huge amount of water here. So I like calling it Turtle Island. Hi, Pamela. So coming back to Terra Nova, or Newfoundland. Newfoundland was left, so the indigenous people that lived there were the Beothuk. They really did not exist any further. There were probably between 1,000 and 1,500, so a very small population, indigenous population on the island. And really, it was a proven fact from the very early days. Hans Island, TNJ, yeah, HANS. So yeah, that's just a neat bit of tradition there. But this great big thing, that the coastline around Newfoundland is 10,000 kilometers. And really, the British and the French, who all had claims to these whole areas. I mean, again, we're going right back here to 1497, 1498. Remember, the Basques have been coming over off the coast. It doesn't show up on the map, but off the coast out in here are the Grand Banks. That's the greatest fishery the world's ever seen. Cabot himself talked about the fact that you could drop down a weighted net, you'd pull it up, and it'd be full of fish. So that was the early fishing that brought people right across the water. But they would come over and they would fish. And of course, particularly Catholic tradition had so many requirements of eating fish. And it was cod, or bacalao in Spanish, morue in French. And they would come over, and then the hard labor wasn't really catching it. It was finding dry places to cut it open, salt it to preserve it, and then take it back to Europe. So many of the people who worked on the English side of the island were there for seasonal work, and they would go over as semi-indentured laborers. They would be paid 2 or 4 pounds for a season. But remember how poor it was in the southwest of England at those times, or Ireland, big Irish presence. They would come over, work for the summer, and then go home with theirs. But they had an abundance of food, and they had labor. But they didn't make any settlements official on the Newfoundland side from British settlement until about probably 1588, maybe even 1610. That's quite debated. And it is one of those debates because we had these great celebrations of Quebec City being the oldest European settlement in North America. But a lot of people in St. John's, Newfoundland don't agree with that. Interesting point. Keep in mind, though, thanks, Viola, major French settlement all the way to the south. What we call New Scotland today, Nova Scotia, was when something like 18 families took the ship, the Hector, over from Scotland and landed in what is now Pictou near New Glasgow up towards the top of Nova Scotia. That's when it became New Scotland. Marlene, that's got to be connected to some of your family. But come over. But previous to that, all of this area was l'Acadie, Acadia. And all of Acadia was based in around right here at the top of the Bay of Fundy. So Jacques Cartier actually sailed into the Bay of Fundy, and what they would do in those days would park their ships. They would get off to go and hunt and forage for food. Remember what it was like? They had to find food to go out in these ships. Well, he came back, and the ships were sitting on their side, tipped over, because these are the biggest tides in the whole wide world. The crossings, Margaret, from what I read, because these were, of course, first by sail, the crossings were generally, I think, as quick as 8 days, but easily, depending on winds, 16, 17 days. So, I mean, it's a massive undertaking. And we'll come back to the crossings in a minute because I think that's an excellent question. But the Acadians, where Wolfville is today, that was Grand Pré. And this is where they built dikes around in the Bay of Fundy. And it was excellent agricultural land. And that was really the birth of l'Acadie, which is a whole different settlement from Quebec. It was all New France, but a whole separate connection there. And what the deal was over here on Newfoundland is the British and the French sort of came to an entente between the two groups, that the whole South Shore was French fishing, and then the East and North was British. That actually switches later on. But let me just show you this peninsula down here. We've got Port aux Basques, which was the town, of course, that was just hammered by that hurricane. The average water temperatures around Newfoundland are about 4 degrees Celsius. They were measured up to 18 degrees this year. That's how come a hurricane picks up strength when it should be petering out and whacks into the south coast. But if you look along the names here, you actually see a very strong French presence right there, for exact, Rose Blanche Harbor, Le Coup, Chanel Port aux Basques. So there's only about 500 actual French speakers in the old French shores here in Newfoundland, Francois, but I encountered names all the time. And there was a gentleman in the course that I was facilitating. Here's Saint-Jacques, but this was the best one because a gentleman has an outport business right here. Now, I would call this Rencontre Est. Hey, Helen. So there's Rencontre Est, and you still get there by a ferry. By the way, the ferry is run by the Newfoundland government, and it's $6 to go across, so now I really want to go there. But Rencontre Est. But when I met the gentleman with his very strong Newfoundland accent, he said to me, well, I'm here from Rencontre East. And he didn't even say that, but Rencontre. And because I had looked at everyone participating, and I'm like, I don't know who you are, sir. I'm really sorry. So I pulled a map out, and I'm from, oh, you're from Rencontre Est. So these were all these little French settlements you had here. So the South Shore was split between, say, the French to the south and the English to the north until the Treaty of Utrecht, which is 1713, if I'm correct. And the French kind of gave up claim to Newfoundland. They just didn't feel they could defend that land there. Don't worry, we're coming to these islands, I promise. But the French, of course, hang on down to the south, and that culminates or leads up to the 7 Years' War, which took how long? 9 years. Hey, Phil. They mainly speak English, Joanne. I'll come back to where the French is spoken. And the British were being defeated so much. The Americans called it the French and Indian War. The British settlements all in around here were being really hammered by the French and their indigenous allies. By the way, the greatest world war, really, that whole war started in Ohio, believe it or not. And the big losers of that war were indisputably the indigenous people because they'd side with one side and get killed by the other. But the French controlled the whole entrance into the St. Lawrence Bay right here at Fort Louisbourg. Have a look sometime. It's run by Parks Canada, but that was the main French fort. When the British moved in, eventually they were so frustrated by their continuous battles that they expelled the Acadians, and they expelled them from this land here, Again, remember, the United States isn't independent yet. We haven't reached 1776. So this is 1755. They start the expulsion, Les Acadiens, and read the poem Evangeline sometime. They go down the coast, and none of the 13 colonies. By the way, we talk so often about the 13 colonies in the U.S. Right here, Nova Scotia was the 14th colony. It just didn't side with the Americans. And then New Brunswick would have been the 15th, but it was created by loyalists who came north. So it's interesting history. They traveled south. They had to go all the way to the French holdings in Louisiana, and Les Acadiens became the Cajun. Now, this is where we jump around with all of this history one more time because it's so fascinating. So the French start to lose, and 1759, 1/3 of the British fleet sail up the St. Lawrence, and they go up to Quebec. And there was General Wolfe on the British side, Montcalm on the French side. But Montcalm thinks he can take Wolfe. They float out boats to blow up the Armada. They miss. The British scale the cliffs. And then old-fashioned war. What happens? Everyone waits till 9 o'clock in the morning. They line up. They shoot. 16 minutes. Both generals die. It took Montcalm overnight. Both generals die. But basically, New France falls to the British. The British fleet carries on up to Montreal. And in, I think, a very respectful move, the French just capitulate. And I respect them for that because why die when it was a done deal? And then in 1763, this is where we're leading up to the great history. 1763, the French and the British finally come to an accord, and it's called the Quebec Act. This is a very important document because it really framed so much of Canadian history as well. And it framed the fact that the French Canadians did not side with the Americans at the War of Independence. The Quebec Act basically handed over governance to the Catholic Church. The French Canadians were allowed to keep their language and religion. That carried on as a debate in this country right up to the 1960s with the Quiet Revolution, and really on a little further until they finally separated the schools in Montreal, which were separated between religions. Why does France, which was still a huge power, right? So they sort of lost the 7 Years' War, but it cost everyone a great deal. Why does France give up all of New France, this massive territory? Remember, Quebec alone has 1 million lakes. Why'd they give it all up, everyone? I know you know the answer to this, but they give it all up to hang on to the most valuable island on Earth, which is right here, the island of Haiti. It's also Martinique, but principally Haiti. 92% of Haiti's population was enslaved. That's why over here in Jamaica, you had the actual pirate ports. Piracy had been legalized by both the British and the French governments to chase the Spanish out. It's another story for another day. They hang on to Haiti because it was sugarcane, and sugarcane was the most valuable product of the 18th century. The harvesting of sugarcane is such a violent undertaking that they had to bring in new enslaved people every year for harvesting that. Now, the movement of all this sugarcane and all this wealth in the triangular trade. Remember lovely Beth, who's not doing tours on Hago now, but in Salem, Massachusetts, talks about this, that triangular route. So the ships, absolutely, Sayuri. Yours was also rubber, wasn't it? But they would go and steal human beings down the coast here. And by the way, and Sayuri does an excellent talk about this, but they would steal human beings. And every now and then, some people think they're being very academic by saying, oh, Africans were part of it too. That doesn't forgive what chattel enslavement means. Like, let's just never back away from how this should be the first taught thing in school anywhere in the Americas. 48% of all enslaved people end up here in the Caribbean. So even when they ended enslavement in the 1790s in the French Empire, it took till 1832 in the British. The French ended it because the slaves kept rising up against the French overlords. Do you know the Haitians defeated both Napoleon and the Spanish? So when their country's in desperate shape, just think of what they've been through. But the ships would come across with the enslaved people. Then they would load up with cane and with rum from here. They would travel then north, either to the American colonies or into Newfoundland, where they would then trade screech, but pick up cod. That's true, Joanne. It's a very, very straightforward statement. But they would pick up cod, and they trade off and give the rum, which is the Newfoundland screech. And by the way, I didn't in the end get screeched in because I go to bed so early and it wasn't busy enough. Getting screeched in is you have a shot of screech and you kiss a cod. I did eat cod though. So they land in here. But the French were also part of this triangular trade. So the one deal they signed in the treaty, the Quebec Act of 1763, is they would have access to a safe French port up here in the North Atlantic. That is where Saint-Pierre Miquelon actually emerged as a French holding. So they are very, very small. They were just another one of the fishing outports. And keep in mind, when you go south from Saint-Pierre Miquelon, the next land you're going to hit is Brazil. So they're perched out there. But that is why, to this day, France has this tiny holding out here in the North Atlantic that is actual French territory. So that was their safe port for whenever they needed services coming up and down with that triangular Atlantic trade. So that goes back to the Quebec Act. That's why France is still here. Now, France tends to, and that's, again, I don't want to overgeneralize, but generally Britain used to run so many of these dominions or these colonies as self-governing. That's exactly what Newfoundland was. Saint-Pierre and Miquelon is an overseas collectivity, but they have a deputy, a member in the National Assembly in Paris. So Saint-Pierre and Miquelon is considered as much part of mainland France as Normandy is, or as the city of Lille is, right? So that is built into their identity. Now, it is interesting as obviously a French-speaking Canadian, because the ferry you drive down this peninsula here, which is called the Burin Peninsula. The reason I'm laughing is it's Burin, the Burin Peninsula. However, the people I was hanging out with were calling it the Bjorn. It was like a J. Fabulous different accents. By the way, even though to the untrained ear or even the trained ear, it sounds like an Irish accent, it's not. Down in these areas is a derivation of English and French. The Irish are up near St. John. So only 22% of Newfoundland is Irish. You'd feel like it's much more, the music traditions, but it's really Western British as well, coming out of that port of Bristol, which of course the great British slave port as well. But Saint-Pierre and Miquelon they really represent life in the St. Lawrence, because Miquelon or Saint-Pierre is small, but that's where just about everyone lives, 6,000 people, and about 600 over on Miquelon. But the little island here is really just a harbor, and it's a rocky outcrop, much like Newfoundland. Looks very much the same way. Whereas Saint-Pierre and Miquelon is how I imagine the Madeline Islands. I haven't been there yet. Now that I finally fulfilled my dream of coming here, now I have to get to the Madeline Islands. But this is a sandbar between the two, and there's about 600 people over. But they were, of course, a distant French service port, isolated as can be. Let me just run through a few photos when I was there, which is just kind of fun. So I just thought this was so cool. This is the port of Fortune in Newfoundland. And this was so cool because it says Miapuick First Nation. And that was the first indication I saw of that in Newfoundland, given that the Beothuk people were wiped out entirely. There are the Caribou people, which have come down from Labrador, where there's a very predominant Inuit culture. But also these people, I expect, have got Mi'kmaq connections, which are the main First Nations communities in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, and the Maritimes. So there'd be a connection there. I just thought that was so cool to see. But let me just run through a few photos here. That's the ferry. Now, those of you who joined my tours in St. John's, I talked about the same formation, the very sharp front, high front, and then the cars are in the back. It's because once you leave the Bay of Fortune, you are in the absolute open North Atlantic Ocean. Now, when we say absolute open, absolutely, Joanne, I would say absolutely that's true. It takes 2 to 3 years for the icebergs to float down from Greenland, and they come in front of the harbor of St. John's. They don't tend to get the icebergs through the harbor around the bottom of the Burin Peninsula and to Saint-Pierre, but they would have had massive ice historically. But really, genuinely big rollers. If you're on TikTok, which I've sort of been on now because I apparently have to be on everything, I did do a little video of sailing over there. But that was the boat. You go through like a full-on, not security, but they control everything. Make sure you have your passport, right? So there I am on the back of the ship. The rollers are great fun. On the way back, thanks, Gregory. On the way back, I was standing with Skipper Bob, who has his own whale watching up in the north of Newfoundland. What a treat to hang out with a guy like that. And he spotted for me, hi, Michelle. He spotted for me minke whales and fin whales. Fin whales are the second biggest whale. And he was a little surprised because you're out of whale season, but they were obviously following food around the south coast. Wasn't this fun? So this little island's called Green Island. These would have been historically home to people because of lighthouses, right? Because of navigation. They're all automated now, so that's been a big change in tradition. But it was really fun to snap a photo as I crossed into France. Are you calling my child Big Casey? Hey Sarah, sorry I didn't see you there. But yeah, the fin whales are really neat and long. The only other time I've seen them was in Cape Cod. I went whale watching out there. So, but it was neat to cross over this international border. I just a couple of just quick shout outs. Obviously, Saint Pierre is very French. They speak with a French accent from France rather than a French Canadian accent, although they understand me just fine, of course. But really, if you live on Saint Pierre, your contact to the rest of the world is to take the ferry over or the flight, and you come to Newfoundland. So there's lots of mixing. One of the people who was the manager of the hotel we're staying at had quite heavily accented English, but her mother was actually from the Burn Peninsula in Newfoundland. So hi Dee. So it's really a neat mix of people. But there we go. That is Île aux Marins. That was an island it's really a living museum now as you come into harbor. Just a super treat to come in. Problem was I was facilitating teaching for like the 2.5 days I was there, so I didn't get to explore as much as I would have liked. By the way, for vegetarian friends on, I do have some food shots just so you know as a heads up. But there's coming in. So there's little Saint Pierre. Now it was a foggy day, but the fog did lift. But look at that lovely lighthouse as you come into the bay. All very formal. And when I got off the boat, I went through French passport control, just like getting off the train from London, right? But 6,000 people. There are 12 flights a year direct to France. Apparently, they book out just about overnight. There's no real tourism option in that because really it's friends and family who are connected to the islands. And it's only a 5.5-hour flight to Paris. Otherwise, there's a flight up to St. John's with Air Saint Pierre and a flight down to Halifax and then return to Montreal. But I had looked at doing that. That's like $1,200. Like it's really tough. But there's the one other ferry. There's two of them that switch back and forth because they go over to Miquelon as well. Because they function as this French overseas collectivity. Fascinating thing to see, right? Sorry, this is the courses we were teaching there, which was fun. That's the head of Newfoundland DMO. Lovely to work with. There's my colleague Leslie that I was working with. But there you go when the sun comes out. Now, there's few places you're going to find yourself as isolated in the world as you are there in Saint Pierre et Miquelon. And during COVID, of course, boom, locked down for 2 years. Now, fortunately, they have access to a lot of food. Now, this can be a source of irritation. The Newfoundlanders, because in 1992, of course, the entire Newfoundland fishery was closed down as it collapsed. One of the greatest sources of food in the whole wide world was overfished and destroyed. And we Canadians, Newfoundland, take some ownership of that. They have a much longer cod season here on the islands than they did over in Newfoundland. And I think the Newfoundlanders have a fair right to say, like, why do they get to play by different rules? But remember that earlier photo I showed you of the island as I was coming into the port? So children were taken over as indentured servants from Brittany during the 17th and 18th centuries. They would come and work the summer because, of course, French families often had 10, 12 children and were very poor as well. Their job were to take the cod, just like in Newfoundland, but out onto the rocks and lay them out and salt them and dry them. So it was very interesting because we went to the museum and the fellow who ran the museum, lovely man, didn't speak a lick of English. It was fascinating. But he said it's not enslavement, but it's indentured servitude. So it gives you a bit of a sense of it. Just a few more photos. This is heading to Sunset. That's the island that they would have dried the cod on in the old days. And then there is Sunset. Another stunning thing, just if I jump ahead a little bit to modern life, is how big the homes were. So I only had a chance to walk around kind of after dark when we'd finished dinners and instructing. But homes that would make these giant suburban homes in places like Calgary look kind of small. I was really interested, but that's because they all got rich on Saint Pierre Miquelon in the 1920s. The 1920s. And why is that? I'll have to go ahead. Sorry, this was fun. Well, that was because of Prohibition. This was a cooking class. Look at this. Like, if I can talk you into a trip to Saint Pierre, just from a culinary point of view, like this guy was a world-class chef from Montreal here, and he can only stay maximum 3 months because it's French laws, right? We don't have any labor exchange with Canada, but just fantastic. So anyway, I had taken these to look at that. I mean, Beautiful tartare. The food was fantastic. Um, that's lobster in there, by the way. But because of Prohibition, this was French territory. I want to get up to some of those photos. Sorry, I've got too many photos here. Um, yeah, this gentleman was, that's right. So, yeah, a lot of eating. That's a scallop in there. It's just, Helen, it was just so delicious. It was just, but, but as, sorry, I've got a lot of food shots for you here. That's, by the way, halibut an onion sauce. Yeah, it was yummy. Oh, and by the way, the potatoes are the ones I make at home with duck. So anyway, just everyone has an interesting look at the evening light. So it make you hungry. But I do want to jump ahead because I've got a proclamation in here that I want to show everyone. Right there we go. So this is where we get to the museum. Some of these bottles, they had full bottles that were found in the attic of what is now the museum of like whiskey bottles going back to the 1930s. Can you imagine? You would have, Chloe, you would have eaten great bread, to be fair. And these are your true bootlegger hip flasks from the early days. You know, they have a curve in them so that you could slide them down your leg. Patrick or Aaron, like they had a bottle of the original Johnny Walker and stuff. I mean, they'd have to be worth thousands, I would think. Yeah, like some of these bottles. There's the rum that came up from the Caribbean, right? So your screechy stuff. Here's this Johnny Walker. Fortunately, I got a lot of flash on it. But these are unopened bottles down through here. I mean, and this gentleman is just, everyone on the island donates history and he's just collecting it all. It's just fascinating. So yeah, this by the way is a fellow who's working on a new an ongoing mural about all the historic figures from the islands. Needless to say, the Catholic Church. Nuns were brought over in 1826. Two of them were brought over and they became kind of the medical staff on the island. And then one came in 1827, which was the first time girls were entitled to any education. Thanks, Helen. This was just fascinating. For those of you interested, I have a bunch of old French francs, but this is when they switched. They had their francs that were overseas francs. But you remember I don't know if you remember this, those of you who spent a lot of time in France, but if you meet older French people, they would refer to les balles. So you'd say something like, something that was 50 new francs, where 500 balles were 500, they dropped to zero. And what they did on the colonies is they restamped them. So 50 overseas francs became one, and the gentleman had the printing press to do that. There it was when they officially restamped the money. So you'd have to climb into French history, but of course then it all switched to the euro, which has changed the game again. It is cool. Like, it's really neat to have. You remember one time I brought out some of my notes. So yeah, in here, I just have to show you this lunch for a second, by the way. This couple, again, barely a word of English, but they had, one of them is from the island, the other is from France, but they're actually bringing in French cheeses and pâtés and everything. So there we go. No, sorry, I was trying to find, I don't know where it was. I'm sorry, somewhere I did have a picture saved, but I don't know where it's gone, of the proclamation. Oh, there it is. Sorry, here it is. There it is. That's the proclamation. Oh, it's the wrong one. Sorry, I'm lying to you. These are all proclamations from Charles de Gaulle in World War II saying they have to be loyal. What I was trying to find is I thought I had a good picture somewhere of the of Prohibition being declared in the United States, because everyone moved over here. Now, for you Canadians on board, I'll just let you mouth water a little bit as we talk about this. But so you had booze that was brought over from France. By the time you're into the 1900s, suddenly they had, of course, engines in their boats. And they had these very interesting shaped, if you're familiar with Newfoundland history, they're called dories. And the dories is how you'd fish offshore for literally several hundred years, right up and down the coast. There was a Saint-Pierre dory with a wider base on it. It was a wider base because it was able to take the rollers in the North Atlantic more than the sheltered bays you would have had around Newfoundland. So that was just a fascinating thing. But then they put motors in them. Now, the motors are right between your feet, so you can imagine the stories of getting your foot caught in that or something. But they had the motors, and they could then ship this stuff either down through Nova Scotia, but they had prohibition in Nova Scotia, but the premier of Nova Scotia was heavily involved, of course, in all of that smuggling as well. But think about, in a Canadian sense, ladies and gentlemen, think about Montreal and the Bronfman family. They produce Seagrams. They literally set themselves up on Saint-Pierre. At one point, the Seagrams family represented somewhere around a seventh of all liquor on planet Earth. We sometimes forget as Canadians how important booze is to the tradition of the country. Remember, what do we call a beer belly? a Molson muscle, right? The Molson family, the Bronfman Seagram's family, and then out west in Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan's all the tunnels for Al Capone when they moved the whiskey down, the whiskey trading that went south. Well, here they moved it all through these warehouses on Little Saint Pierre, and the money that flowed in means that even today, the collectivity is actually an extremely wealthy area as compared to other areas. It's also heavily, heavily subsidized by France, the way they do with their overseas. But yeah, it's fascinating history. This food was, the spread they put on with us was just amazing. I love that kind of food. It was fun though. A couple of the people from small town Newfoundland, they were totally polite. I mean, the Newfoundlanders are as friendly and hospitable as their reputation, and it does precede them. But some of them just didn't get on with the food. There, by the way, is, I think, the governor's residence, traditionally, because it had the French flag on it. But that was a chance just to look around. Sorry, just a bit more teaching. Look at the evening light now out through here. You could be in a small town in Brittany. That's what it felt like to me. So, I mean, pretty neat to see. Lovely reflections. Look at that. Sorry, this is another meal. I couldn't help it. Those are coquilles Saint-Jacques, foie gras, which I just gorged myself on. And that was guinea fowl, and there's lobster. So anyway, it's become such a culinary destination. But this to me is the funniest sign that I came across, because if you've driven through France, you have these signs that welcome you to the towns, and then they tell you when you've left the town. But the entire island to drive around, it's 25 kilometers, and Saint Pierre is the only place. So you drive out of Saint Pierre, you loop around, and you drive back into Saint Pierre. But that's that kind of typical, very French administration, right? That is a French rule, and so that's what you have to do. I love the sign for the lower speed limit for big trucks. By the way, I was interested how low the speed limits were in Newfoundland. But again, I think it's probably a winter factor and a moose factor. Thanks, Patty. You may or may not know, but moose were actually introduced to Newfoundland twice, 1870s and then again in 1906 or something, and there's over 10,000. Diane, it was sort of 3 days, really. But yes, I mean, that much food. And breakfast was just impact, like the lovely croissants. I just didn't eat it because I knew lunch would be that big. Look at this lovely mural on the side. This is all from the Prohibition days. These are all, I think, oh, maybe not. That might be hay coming in. But this is out of the old economy of Saint Pierre Miquelon. So again, 6,000 people, not enough hotel rooms or services, no fast food at all. And sometimes, and they eat later, they eat about 7:30 or 8 at night. But if you don't have a reservation, you might not get food when you go over to the island. So, before you plan a trip, contact me. I am going to produce a tour and sell it to Newfoundland. And I'll use Halifax as the gateway, but I would go up to St. John's, come down the Burn, and then fly out of Saint Pierre is how I would probably work it out. This was leaving. Thanks, Ruth. There's the ferries, which again are run by the government of France. You see where it says collectivité territoriale. But let me just tell you a little bit. So the ferry's really nice. Everyone's friendly, like warm, friendly. But because it's a ferry that's run by the French government, it does not accept Canadian dollars. They just have no duty free on it, which is shocking to me, given that would be the reason to go there. Thanks, Robert. And then if you get a coffee for €1, but they will not take a Canadian dollar, but there's nowhere to change money. Like, these were some of the things that I was kind of working through with their tourism authorities. And they know about it, but they administer themselves like much bigger territories within France, places like Corsica or New Caledonia. So they actually have all the government departments. So out of 6,000 people, 80% in some way are associated with the French government. Ah oui, c'est la France quand même. That's a cool little ferry that in the good season does a quick run over to the south part of Miquelon. So that was neat to see. Look at these streets, though. I mean, sparkling clean, of course. Thanks, Diane. But just, yeah, totally Euros. Yep, totally the Euros. And this is sailing away. So that's where I did do a little video. And there's sailing back to Canada. Now, let's come back. And I want to open it up to questions just in a minute. That's coming back into Fortune Bay. And then we came back and had Newfoundland food, which is just heavy. These are all the different people all over Newfoundland participating in the course we were doing. It was just a real treat to meet them. Look at that. That's all homemade pies. And those are all berries collected around Newfoundland. Thanks, Brenda. So, I don't know if I come away saying I'm going to sell up everything and move to Newfoundland, but it's embarrassing to me that I hadn't been. I mean, a place I know all about. It was my 10th province. But say my return flights were $1,400 and I can fly to London for about $900. It's one of the challenges. So I don't think there's anything else here. Yeah, that's the team that we were working with, so the ticket office. But I just want to come back and tell you one other quick story on the map, because everyone who's here knows about Come From Away, right? Everyone knows about all the planes. It is, Robert, all the planes that were trapped in Newfoundland and the West Coast, but particularly Newfoundland. Just so you know where that is and why that's so important. Again, these roads, the roads are way, thanks, Chloe, way younger in a Newfoundland history. For 400 years, people lived in all these tiny little places around the corner. You didn't go inland unless you were hunting, I suppose. But there's Gander right there in the middle. Let me scan in a bit. So when you're a Gander Newfoundlander, you're inland, you're on the Gander Lake. But really, Gander's whole raison d'etre was the big airstrip that was built at the point at which people started with flights going across the Atlantic and they had to refuel. So that's why it's significant. And they were able to there's Gander International Airport. So Gander itself is Greater Gander is about 11 or 12,000 people. And so many jumbo jets landed there because they didn't go into American airspace. And of course, it took so long to clear them out that the people of Gander received as many people as they have in their community. And a movie was made called Come From Away, or a show, I should say. And it's just what lovely thank you to these incredibly hospitable people. And you hear the stories around Newfoundland because it's small town living, right? But how people rally. However, the thing I wanted to talk about that, because as a shout out to the Burn Peninsula and everything I learned while I was down there, the very first Come From Away was here. Did you, Dee? Yeah. The very first Come From Away in true sense is here in St. Lawrence. And there were several participants in the course from St. Lawrence, including a counselor. St. Lawrence was a mining place, and with all the predictable diseases, the silicosis in the mines. But this is where, and I'm sorry, I'm not going to remember the exact date, but you see where it says U.S. Memorial Health Center? That's because two ships were grounded, two American military ships, which of course spent a lot of time around Newfoundland during World War II, were grounded in bad tides, and the people of St. Lawrence went out and saved something like 1,500 American seamen. They went out and did that, and they did save them, and then they were come and rescued, and the Americans, as a thank you, built a hospital for the people of St. Lawrence, a memorial center. Like that alone is a reason to go and travel to that part of the world. I mean, just a fascinating thing to learn about. And I did not know that story. That's where it's so neat getting to go on these kind of things where you learn that. And then, of course, now it's so much easier because I can Google stuff as I go along. But fascinating bit of history there too. And the connection. And remember, if you did join me on one of my tours in St. John's, they really did. So Newfoundland enters Canadian Confederation in 1949. They did so because Newfoundland bankrupted itself in World War I by being incredibly loyal to the British Empire, raising all the money to send over 12,000 men, 3,600 killed or wounded in one battle in about 15 minutes near Vimy. I've seen the memorial there, the Caribou. They just didn't have the finances to govern themselves. They lost another 23,000 people in World War II. And then 1949, they were given three choices in amongst themselves, either independence, an economic union with the United States, but that probably would have been a bit like Puerto Rico, I would think, or to join Canada. And the reason why is because Canada, after that Quebec Act, took all the way to World War II before Canada had unemployment insurance, a housing system, and then that led to healthcare. And Joey Smallwood and the team that saw that on the side decided that Canada was the right move. I think it's still debated in Newfoundland every now and then. But I can tell you what, you go to Newfoundland, and of course, so many Newfoundlanders come west to work. I mean, their world collapsed in 1992. Imagine your family for 300 years fishing, and suddenly tomorrow saying you're done, right? So it's a fascinating thing. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, I was looking very professorial with the glasses on, but let me see. Are there any questions? Is there? I know this isn't. I mean, we still touched on enslavement. We still touched on war. We still touched on smuggling, but it's not as necessarily. It's just more of a travel log today. I would have loved to have taken you all out for a tour of Saint Pierre myself, But again, I didn't have time, and I did have reception issues. I paid to turn my phone on, but I think it kept picking up the Canadian one. Thanks, Tara. And then jumping across. I think that's maybe why I had some issues. I'm not sure, but sometimes it's the app. I mean, I'm in home with Wi-Fi here, and it's bouncing around a little bit. But it was a fascinating place to spend time. Needless to say, and then because I was able to get up and down, because I'll show you one more thing, Casey. I'll show you one more fun experience, because what you do in the Maritimes. Thank you, Viola. So this gentleman is going to be the nexus of tourism in the area, because he speaks French, but he comes from Fortune, and he's able to book the ferry, because even that is confusing. And given that 95% of their visitors come from Canada, but there's Captain Bob. So they invited us over for a kitchen party. Scallops that they caught themselves, cod. Do notice I was always trained, if you go to thanks Mary Lou, if you go to stay at someone's house, you always take something, a bottle of wine. I brought the bottle of wine and said, "Oh, thanks, put it on the counter," and they pulled out the rum. so, and I wasn't even driving, so that was kind of fun. But yeah, just great conversation. So yeah, let me tell you actually about the Irish, Joanne, because look at those scallops, by the way, and I've got some new recipe ideas. That port was part of that story. He told me the story, has this bottle. That was part of the port that was actually Prohibition port. And he had a full bottle of it. So I think that's a really neat thing as well. So that's a great thing. That was the B&B that I stayed at after. But yeah, in terms of the Irish, I got to, seeing as how it's Newfoundland, I got to show you a moose, eh? So there's a moose at the crossing where you turn south. And there's Quiddy Viddy, which is the bay just the other side of Signal Hill, where some of you joined me for, I think, one of the most beautiful sunsets. And because it's Newfoundland, there's a gentleman fishing right off the harbor right there. Isn't that gorgeous? So yeah, it was a real treat to see. But yeah, in terms of the Irish, let me just come back to the map for a second. So the most famous place, if you want to Google something really fun, have a look up here in Fogo Island. So it is Fogo Island here, where they say is the purest Irish dialect. Well, Brenda, I'll tell you how I'll do it, but it won't include Fogo, unfortunately. So they say it's the purest dialect from the 18th century, would have been the west of Ireland. And the last Irish or Gaelic that sort of disappeared around the turn of the last century, the early 1900s. But they've built this fabulous hotel on Fogo. Feel free to Google it. But it's like $3,000 a night. So that's a very, very elite sort of tourism. Yeah. And so I had sort of talked, even with Leslie, who I was teaching with, sort of said, why don't we, maybe look at going on for a couple of days. And then it was just so cost prohibitive. But there's a loop in around the Avalon Peninsula. TNJ, that's a great question. I'll just finish with the Irish and then I'll answer that question as best I can. And please, I'm not an ocean specialist, but this area down here is called the Irish Loop. So this is where you had the biggest concentration of the Irish language. And so that's about the 22%. Although if you went across Newfoundland today, really overwhelmingly people are from the British Isles and Ireland, right? So the cod population is recovering and they do have a cod fishery. So the short answer is yes, although that's under risk because, we don't want to point fingers too much, but the Spanish with their dragnet fishing and come in just off the Grand Banks. And that's a great debate between Canada and Spain particularly, but sometimes the French. So that is a legitimate thing. There are other fisheries. There's herring and mackerel, and that was still on while I was there. There is a type of crab fishery that's been interesting that apparently proved really, really profitable for them. So yes, there is a fishery, but it's very heavily controlled now. And that's why if you join me on the tours, of course, we saw the huge Coast Guard ships. So it is there. The main economy out here for about 20 years, the main economy in Newfoundland really was remittance. What's remittance? It's when you go away and send money home. So that's the fellows flying all the way out to Alberta. Hey, I went to the airport at 3:30 in the morning for the 5 a.m. flight, and I sat and had a breakfast sandwich. And there were two fellows beside me. It was so nice chatting with them. They're 2 weeks on in northern BC, and then they fly home for a week. And they do that like every 3-4 weeks through season, and they're up doing oil and gas. Then they come home. So that lovely skipper Bob I was talking about, he was off to work on some drilling near Spain for 2 months. So they are a traveling people, and they were from the very earliest days. Now, not as ethnically diverse as other parts of the country, needless to say, but off the banks here, they actually have oil production, 5 different oil systems, 2 fixed platforms and 3 mobile. It's creating a lot of work. And so maybe the Irving family, who runs all the oil in the Maritimes, could stop buying oil from Saudi Arabia and they could buy Canadian oil. Maybe just a hint to them. Wouldn't be a bad idea, right? But nevertheless, we've got a problem with fossil fuels in our country. And that in these waters because there are now great white sharks here. Like, it was a huge shock to the system when they showed up in Cape Cod. Now they're in the waters off Newfoundland, which are meant to be cold fisheries. Terry and Jolene, thank you so much. But the icebergs come right down here. They come down. So we'll go back out to our pictures. They calve off the coast of Newfoundland, or off Greenland here. Like, there's the capital of Greenland, Nuuk. They calve off here and they float down all the way to the currents. And I did have to Google it when I was there, but right around down about here is about where the Titanic hit one, maybe a little further north than that. Do you know when the Titanic went down, the Newfoundlanders all got out in their ships to go and try and save people? Like, that's how genuine they are as a population. By the way, for you Canadians on board, I don't know if you saw the news today. Officially, 23% of Canadians are not Canadian born now. Overwhelmingly the largest largest immigrant population in the G8 or the G7. And they're saying, I'd have to look it up, but by 2041, it'll be 39% of Canadians. So it's nice to see that some of that's reflected in our federal government. It is not reflected in the new Alberta cabinet under Daniel Smith. If you'd like another raw history, let me give you one about Daniel Smith and people who somehow believe in conspiracy theories and all of that. But the rock, just if you're interested in the geology at all, I did know the history, but I went to the Geoscience Center and that was a real treat. So the rock on Newfoundland is basically the same age as the rock that I have here, of course, in my mountains, but it's because the rock around me that's 400 or 500 million years old here was thrust up out of the ground by the Pacific Plate, shoving its way under the North American plate, whereas this is that same lower rock that was shoved up, but it's been carved down by glaciation, of course, over about 2.5 million years. And there's still permanent ice up in the north of Labrador up here. So Labrador, I still haven't made it to, but that'd be a real treat. There's only 24,000 people in this entire territory up here. And then this bay here is worth talking about at some point, because this is Ungava, and that is an Inuit bay, but in the province of Quebec. Our friend Paula from Ireland, who, of course, is over with Leslie right now in having a wonderful time in Egypt, but she bought a bottle of that Ungava Bay gin that comes from up there, which is an Inuit business. So that's pretty cool. I'm still not going to drink the gin, but I always try and promote it because it's pretty neat to think that there's an Inuit business up there. Let me just one more tiny focus in here, which is just the fun of it. So you see how tiny Pierre Miquelon are, right? They still barely make the map over there. And then you've got Prince Edward Island, but there are the Madeline Islands here as well. 8 communities, 7 which are French-speaking, 1 which are English-speaking out here. Again, these little... Marlene, I think you mentioned that. That's so cool. So yeah, all these communities. And I'm sort of in touch with the guy who comes out and works in the oil fields, but he and his brother have a lobster boat in the summers there. And so it's really everything I know about lobster fishing I learned from them. So it's pretty neat. And then it's a ferry over here into Prince Edward Island. So that's kind of that part of the world there. And in Cape Breton, more people speak Gaelic, Scottish Gaelic, than they do in Scotland today, although that is fading. So anyway, ladies and gentlemen, we really have hit time. So thank you for coming to play. I know everyone's been asking me for the raw histories, but as winter starts to come on here, I'll be able to do a few more talks if you're ever particularly interested. I really never try and opine on subjects I don't know anything about, and I didn't feel like, until I had been here, I was able to give a talk about it. But well, you're very welcome. It was certainly fun to share it. It's an interesting part of the world. I love the fact that Patrick and Aaron are here, because I think if you're in New York, suddenly you're so, and Toronto and places, you're so aware of Newfoundland after come from away, which is a lot different than than how little known some of these places may have been. It's fun, gentlemen. It's nice to see. So what have I got? I've got a conference call here in about 15 minutes or so. I'm doing one tour out today on a different platform. And then I'm watching the weather because I've got one for high up a mountain, but I don't know which mountain I'm going to hike up tomorrow yet because the weather's not as clear as I was hoping it would be. So we'll see what it looks like, but I'll do that. Anyway, I'm glad you enjoy this sort of thing, ladies and gentlemen. It's fun to offer this kind of sharing. My kid lands on Friday. Somehow I got Saturday in my head. He lands on Friday, so it'll be great to have him home. And that's good. And oh, by the way, just a couple other quick things. So I've been in contact with Vanessa in Lima, and we'll do a tour together, but it'll be under her page when I'm down there. And then we'll do one. I'll do a couple for sure up in Arequipa, and I put in one that I'm going to try and do at 5,000 meters. I'm going to go up with Elizabeth and her family, and then I'm going to make some plans around Cusco and Bolivia and everything. But I know everyone likes to have tours out there way in advance, but I'm going to be on a bit of a vacation, so I'll put up tours as it works. But still, I still have to fly to Montreal on the 6th of the month. I'm away 5 days there and then home. But I will be in Ottawa. And I will be busy, Robert, but I'm sure we can try and squeeze in a visit or something, do a quick Hagel get together when I'm down there. So, all right, everyone. Peace and love. Oh, commence à la prochaine. I do have, by the way, a tin of Bourgogne escargot and some duck for when the family arrives home. So that's my plan to cook on Friday night because Finn's having his girlfriend over for dinner. So it does sound pretty yummy, doesn't it? Oh, all right. I didn't say that. Don't repeat that. No rumor mills. All right, ladies and gentlemen, listen, all the very best. Have a wonderful day wherever you are in the world. And there's my little world out back there. And Patrick and Aaron, as we always say, a guest room for you right here waiting. So, all right. Take care, ladies and gentlemen. We see you as soon as possible. Lots of love. Bye-bye.